All right, so this is chapter 34. This is decolonization or post-colonial Africa, the Middle East, and portions of Asia. We'll tackle the rest of Asia in chapter 35. Again, by way of introduction, today is going to be a somewhat depressing day. So we'll just lead off with that. And it's okay for you to feel, a little depressed by some of this. That's good. It means you have a heart, and it means that heart is functioning. If you're able to walk away from all this today and be like, man, it sucks to be those people, and that's it, we've missed the mark by a little bit. So part of what we're trying to do today is not just convey the historical content, but try to allow you to empathize with people that are placed in this situation. All right, so when we look at this from a thematic standpoint, what is going on in Africa and the Middle East once the Europeans leave? Let's ask this first. What caused most of the Europeans to leave these places they had colonized?
No money.
All right, part of it's financial.
They didn't have enough soldiers left to maintain their hold on colonies.
Okay, part of it's logistics, not enough manpower. What's the overriding theme, Eileen? Okay, in some cases they promised they would let them go. Neha? How so? What's that? Good. Nationalism in the colonies that made them desire independence. What's the big event that really serves as kind of the impetus for this independence movement? Alia? World War II. Good. Because by the end of it, Western Europe finds themselves less able to exert the same amount of financial and physical control over its colonies. You couple that with the local sense of nationalism that they want their independence now, and you have this perfect storm where the Europeans finally decide it's better to cut and run than drag this out and lose money, which was the reason they went there in the first place, was to make money.
Now, was there any physical damage from the war in the areas in North Africa where it was fought? Any lasting physical damage?
Lasting, like how long lasting?
As in that it became a major issue for the countries that they...
So you're talking about like all the tank battles and whatnot?
Yeah.
I don't think anything that was... No, I don't think that was any sort of significant factor, especially because that was such a small section of Africa that was impacted by World War II. So for those particular countries, that may have been a small issue, but no, from a larger viewpoint, it's minimal. All right, let's look at some of these larger issues that are going to pop up now when the Europeans leave. And we'll look at it as something like this. As long as the Europeans are there, who is the focus of the locals' hostility and frustration and all of that? The Europeans. Okay, so if we put this in teenage perspectives, and again, I'm hoping that you have a very happy, loving relationship with your parents. But oftentimes with siblings, they get frustrated by their parents, right? Their parents don't let them do the things they want to do. They have rules, they have punishments, they have all of that. And oftentimes the siblings can both agree that they don't like how they're being treated. It's unfair, and then they cry and whatever, and it's sad, and then they realize they're 18 and they shouldn't be crying anymore. Anyway, what happens if the parents leave for an extended week-long trip? Hang on. Those early hours, that first day is characterized by what? Chaos, laziness, celebration, like just reveling in their freedom, right? But then as we progress to day 2, day 3, day 4, what starts to come up? All right, somebody needs to take control because you're hungry and you need food. And so you turn to each other, you're like, I'm hungry. Yeah, me too. Well, who's going to cook for us? Oh, I'm not going to do it. Well, I'm not going to do it. Yeah, you are. I'm bigger. You go cook. I don't know how to cook. All right, so you start to see these problems come up that during the time that you were being, quote unquote, oppressed by your parents, you'd never really had to worry about. Now, I'm not using this to say that colonization was great and beneficial, and everybody in Africa and the Middle East and Asia should have been so thankful the Europeans showed up. That's not the point. I want you to see the power struggle. As long as the Europeans are there, the natives are unified in their resentment and frustration, and it's always easy to point to the white folk and say they're the reason for our problems. When the white people leave, you now get these new tensions that pop up. Tensions that up until this point, they've been able to largely keep a lid on. Sometimes by force, and sometimes just because you're distracted by the fact that you hate the Europeans so much. So you wake up after that first day of freedom, and you realize that independence has not brought you the things that you thought it would. You don't wake up the next day after independence and magically everybody has a job and they're all middle class or better and driving cars and living in real homes instead of ramshackle huts put together from corrugated scrap metal. You don't wake up the next day and suddenly have zero problems with famine and malnourishment. You don't wake up the next day and have all of those problems solved. All of those problems still exist and have to be solved. And now you're the ones in charge and have to solve them. So what happens? Well, one of the things that happens is those societies then fragment. And they split apart based on ethnic lines or tribal lines or religious lines. Because again, who drew all these boundaries in the first place? Europeans. And did Europeans draw these boundaries with careful consideration as to who was living there and how those people were going to interact with each other?
No, they drew their boundaries as to how much territory they could get.
Right. They drew their boundaries based on how much land they could get and what was in that land. I know there's a gold mine there, so I want to make sure that's on my side. It doesn't matter if I just divided a village. Ooh, I know that there's oil there. I want that. It doesn't matter if my line that I just drew now forcibly combines two groups of people that have hated each other for centuries. Oh well. Right, I get what I want, and that's all that matters. And so you're going to see this in so many places throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. We talked about this before with India. Yeah, Tarina? Oh, that's a great question. What if Europeans had never gone to Africa, I'm assuming to colonize? That is so hard to answer because that changes so many things. Because if Europeans never go to Africa to colonize, the slave trade may have never happened, which means there's 10 million plus Africans that are never uprooted, which means family structures and political structures and culture is potentially far more stable. It means that some of the civilizations that rose because of the slave trade would never have risen in the first place, and some of the ones that fell because of competition may have had the chance to go on and become stronger, like Mali or Songhai. There's just so many things that could have happened. One possible outcome is Africa becomes far stronger and more stable, or that still in some way, shape, or form they find themselves in a dependent place because of the rest of the things that happen. But then again, it begs the question, without Europeans ever going to Africa, there's really no need to colonize the Americas as much as they do, which then limits the need for industrialization, which, right, at that point your head just starts spinning, you're like, cannot process. So that is a fantastic question that we unfortunately will probably never have a satisfactory answer to. Nick?
Now, what if World War II had ended early before it really got to deep bloodshed, and European countries have had the manpower, logistics, and want to keep their colonies?
If you could have made World War II shorter, you're right, it's possible that colonization would have hung on longer, but I think what we would have found is that we still get to a point in 21st century society where it's just not okay for one country to own another sovereign nation. You still have territories and things like that today. But by and large, colonialism has really gone away as something that's just not appropriate anymore. So would it have stretched it for another 20 years, 30 years? Quite possible. Would that just set everything back further? Maybe. Would it have possibly stabilized things? Who knows? Again, this is one of the fun things with history, is to ask all these what-if questions, but it's also one of the really frustrating ones because we never get to find out. Now, one of the ways that Europeans made these situations worse, and we'll go back to our home analogy. Now, by the way, I'm going to use me just because it's easier, but let me preface it with, this did not happen to me. I did not have a troubled childhood. But let's say, for instance, that between my little brother and I, what if my parents had constantly played the favorite with only my little brother? He got all the best presents. He didn't have to do any chores. He got a ridiculous allowance. Meanwhile, it's like, almost a Cinderella case. Like, I have to do all of the chores. I don't get any allowance. I have to vacuum and dust and sweep and mop and do the dishes and take the dog out and scoop the poop and do all of that. He gets the bigger room. I get the smaller room. I get his hand-me-downs, which doesn't work because I'm bigger than him. How do I start to feel after years of this treatment?
Very, very angry.
Very, very angry. Right. Especially because I'm older. I'm bigger. There's more of me. Right? By rights, I should be getting more. But why are they catering to my little brother? Because he's little. He's cute. He is cuter, actually. He's easier to manipulate, maybe. I don't know. But for whatever reason, they dote on him, and I get screwed. Now, let's fast forward to that same 1-week vacation, and the parents leave. What happens? I have a great week. Because with them gone, I can now reassert myself as the bigger, stronger one, and there's nobody there to defend him or protect him or stop me. And now I've got, however long it's been, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, of repressed anger at this unfair treatment. If you want to go with another analogy, it's Harry Potter. Living under the stairs, doing all of the work, no thanks, no appreciation, no love. I mean, at some point, you snap a little bit, right? Nobody said insane killing spree yet. Calm down. Jeez. So, when the Europeans leave, oftentimes to secure their power in these countries, they had supported the quote-unquote younger brother, the minority tribe or ethnicity or religion, because they were easier to manipulate. They already were at a disadvantage, so they would be far more inclined to go along with the Europeans. And so if the Europeans give them better jobs in government, if they reward them with better trading opportunities, if they set them up in nicer neighborhoods, if they forcibly take the majority population and set them below and use them as servants, it works great as long as the Europeans are there. Because that minority population will help perpetuate the European system. But what happens when the Europeans leave? Right, you now have a very pissed off majority who wants justice for however many years of unfair treatment. Now, if this is a one-on-one thing, going back to me and my brother, I might be able to say to him, you know what? You didn't do this to me. You're my brother. I love you, man. And we'd hug it out a little bit and be like, you know what? Forgive and forgotten. But what are the chances that that happens when you're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people?
Someone's going to get mad at someone else, and there's going to be a fight, and someone's going to die, and then it's going to...
Right. Somebody is going to stay mad. lots of somebodies potentially. This is going to become one of the big stumbling blocks, is these ethnic rivalries or religious rivalries that the Europeans in some cases either started or helped to support at the same time that they suppressed the actual violence by being there and being in charge and not letting it happen. Again, as long as, and again, preface, I don't even know what we're at. It's not a preface because we're already through it, but this didn't happen to me. But as long as our parents are there to stop me from beating up on my brother, I can't beat up on my brother, right? But once they leave, all bets are off. This is just one of many, many problems that are going to come up. How does that impact the country's advancement then? What are you spending all your time and energy on? Right. Are you spending on industrialization and modernization and improving your country and working together?
No, you're buying new guns, new tanks,
right.
new planes.
You're working on revenge and retribution. Emily, what was your question? Volatile, unstable, combustible, ripe for opportunities for new violence or bad things to happen. Because they're easier to keep control over. They are less of a threat to the Europeans because they're the smaller group. And the Europeans plus the smaller group outnumber and outweigh the bigger group. Yep. Easier form of control. Okay, so now we need to add to this problem. This problem by itself, I'm hoping you see, is already really hard to solve. Right? Because you now have to find people that are willing to move beyond generations of abuse or neglect or disadvantage and say, you know what, it's in the past. Let's forget it all and let's move forward and work together. How hard is that? Very hard. And again, it'd be hard enough if it was one person. Forgiveness is hard enough when it's one person. How much harder is it when we're talking about tens of thousands? It's tens of thousands of times harder because each one of those people has an individual story. And you can't just make an entire group of people say, you're all going to forgive all of them. Okay? Presto. Done. It doesn't work like that. Let's add another problem to this. Population growth. Africa's population growth in the 20th century explodes upward for a number of reasons. One, the slave trade has ended. Two, new agricultural crops have been introduced that are more nutritious, which leads to better diets. Three, when the Europeans were there, and again, this is not a statement in support of European colonization that it was a great thing. But when the Europeans were there, because they were there to financially profit, they needed to make sure that they squelched all other issues. Those being warfare between tribes and ethnic groups and religions, and famine, because you get more work out of people if they are better fed. So if people aren't dying as often and they're being better fed, what happens to population? It grows. Also, in many of these countries, for religious reasons, either conservative Christian, conservative Muslim, conservative tribal religion, whatever, 20th century birth control methods are not acceptable. So even though the technology becomes available to limit the number of births, society will say, no, that is not okay. And in many cases, your worth as a man, your manliness, isn't about how big your biceps are or how fast you run. It's about how many children you father. Optionally to the same woman. And for the woman, your womanliness isn't measured by intelligence or beauty or skill in any area in your life. It's measured by one thing: how many children you give birth to. So again, you've created a society where population has no choice but to go up, because you've encouraged men and women to procreate as often as possible to prove their social worth. All of those things combined, better nutrition, ending warfare and famine, limiting birth control, and perpetuating a culture where your value is based in part on your offspring, causes a population explosion within just a few generations. I mean, if my wife and I had 9 kids, and then each of our kids had 9 kids, right, that's going from 2 to almost 100 in 2 generations. What happens if a village of 100 does that? What happens if a country of 100,000 does that? Yeah. Now you're getting a sense of the scope. Nick?
Yeah. Why did this system of the Europeans that ended the war and famine completely collapse after they left?
Because they left. And they were the ones enforcing that system, again, by promoting one group over the other. Or simply being the physical military intermediary between the 2 warring groups and simply saying, if you fight, we'll shoot you.
But why didn't anyone stand up and take that voice?
Who's going to? The minority group that's always been in power anyway? So again, if we go back to our home issue, the parents leave, it's my brother and I. I've got 10 years of repressed anger, and he stands up and he says, all right, John, I'm in charge of you now. Just like always, go clean my room. Really? You think you can make me do that now? So then I turn it on him and be like, no, I'm bigger than you. You go clean my room. He's like, I'm not doing that. I've never done that a day in my life. What do we do then? Right, we fight. That's why the system doesn't last, because who's going to step in and be the intermediary between the 2 of us? I can't step in between the 2 of us. He can't step in between the 2 of us. Right, so at some point, somebody else would have to come back in and stop the fighting, which isn't going to solve the problem, because I've still got 10 years of anger that I want justice for.
What if that person steps in and makes you the person in charge?
So then all I'm going to do is persecute him to get revenge for those 10 years, which then builds a new cycle of resentment and frustration. Some of you, despite all the disclaimers, are going, wow, he had a really troubled childhood. I swear, none of this happened. It just makes for a convenient example. No, hang on. Don't start any statement with, so the only way to solve it is.
We could solve it by we could solve this cycle of hatred and resentment by allowing them both to work at the same time.
Okay, so let's try that option. You allow a representative from both groups to rule jointly. So you set up my brother and I as co-rulers. Okay, so what if somebody, and again, I'm glad you guys are engaging in this. So what if we have somebody else come in and quote-unquote take over again just in the intermediary period? What do we go right back to, especially now that we have tasted freedom? Right, but you would either need us to embrace the fact and ask for somebody to come in. Because otherwise, if somebody forcibly comes in and says, all right, clearly you 2 are dysfunctional, talking to my brother and I. You're screwed up, you're spoiled, you're just damaged. I'm going to tell you what to do now and fix this. We're going to be right back on the same team. Who does he think he is? I know, seriously, we get along just fine, right? Yeah, totally. What is he going to do for us that we can't do ourselves? And so we'll both fight back against him and resist until he's like, you know what, forget it. I tried to help, I'm leaving. And we're like, oh, good. You. And we're right back to where we were. Now, again, this is a huge oversimplification. And that's where I told you it's going to get to the point where you feel a little depressed because it seems like there is no solution. I want you to see why this is so hard. I want you to get past the point of, oh, well, it's simple. All you do is this. And I want you to hear the reasons why that doesn't just magically fix everything. And I want you to embrace and empathize with the struggles that are taking place here that are far, far removed from anything that the majority of you will ever have to deal with in your life. You live in Loudoun County, Virginia. You are privileged even amongst the privileged. This is so far removed from your experience that for many of you, your brain is going to shut down in the next few minutes because you're like, well, this is just too hard, I quit. It's not my problem. And that's where it stops for a lot of people. Nick?
There's only one actual thing that
Don't say there's only one.
and that would be if one group is able to completely wipe out the other.
That has been proposed. You simply let one group wipe out the other. That is awful. And in 21st century society, it's not socially or politically acceptable. You can't just say, well, we're going to let you all die. Sorry, it's best for everybody else.
Or just kick them out of the country.
To where?
To the next country.
To the next country.
Be like, you, next door neighbor, you have our problem.
Please do not go into government. Okay, a couple other things to get into. Let's say for the moment that we could get a handle on all of these other issues. Let's say we could stabilize society. We could put a temporary freeze on ethnic and tribal conflicts. Let's say we could do all of that. You still have to find a way to compete on the 21st century economic stage. And here's the problem for a lot of these countries. You can't industrialize easily. And there's a couple of reasons why. Reason number one is, what has your economy been based on up until this point? Export of raw materials. Good. Which then means the money that you make as a country goes back into increasing your output of raw materials. So let's say that I wanted to become a mechanic. I got tired of teaching. If I want to stop teaching and go be a mechanic, what am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to learn. Now, the fastest way for me to do that is to quit teaching entirely and go back to school and take like a 2-year crash course in automotive mechanic. What happens in those 2 years to me?
You run out of money.
Right, I run out of money because I don't have a paycheck. What happens to my house?
It gets taken away.
Right, and my car.
It gets taken
The thing I'm trying to learn how to fix. Right. It goes away. So my means of supporting myself would go away. Even though that would be the fastest possible method, it's not really feasible.
That's when you take night school.
Okay, so you find a partial fix. You stretch the process out longer. But then what happens when things come up? So let's say I'm trying to go to night school to be an auto mechanic, but then my car breaks down and I still don't know how to fix it. Now the money I was going to spend on the next night school class has to go to fixing my car. Let's say there's, epic Hurricane Sandy that comes in and rips the roof off my house. I need to fix that. I can't go to night school. Things come up and that money gets diverted.
You find a way for someone else to help you pay your tuition and government or your business.
Okay, so then I look for loans or some sort of financial aid. Typically those things have to be repaid. And as an auto mechanic, I'm not going to make a ton of money right away. Plus, I'm going to have to be paying for all of that debt that I incurred in the process of getting educated. So again, it's never a simple fix. Be like, oh, well, you just do this, it's fine. No, it's hard. That's why people that have lost jobs have such a hard time finding new jobs in a different field. Right, so you just check a bunch of books out from the library, and because you're a genius, you just teach yourself all these things. That's why you guys have stopped coming to class and you just read your textbook, right? Oh. Right, it's my melodious voice that puts you all to sleep. Okay, and then the last thing, because of all of these other problems,
The computer does not like you.
I put the computer to sleep. It took some of you a second for that one. It's okay. You get past all of these other issues, and in some way, it's actually because of all of these other issues that the governments are incredibly unstable. Either because of the ethnic division, which makes the government only want to cater to part of society, or because the population is so big that the government simply can't distribute society's resources evenly. For whatever reason, for a variety of reasons, many of the governments in these countries seriously struggle to make any effective change. And if after so long, well, some of you guys know the answer to this. For those of you that have struggled, quiz after quiz, chapter after chapter, quarter after quarter, where do you eventually get to? Giving up. And then, let's say you've reached that point of, well, this is hopeless. All of a sudden, you have your lucky break, and I drop the answer key to the next major exam on the floor.
You take it.
If you've reached rock bottom and you've given up, and now all of a sudden you see this lifeline to turn your grade around, right, of course you give it right back and you don't take advantage of it, right? Exactly. And so what you find in a lot of these cases, right, because the teacher's too dumb to realize that suddenly everybody got A's.
I mean, yeah, but like, they're not going to find out who's the one.
Okay, let's get away from the school example because it's not really relevant. One of the things you see is that when people are able to make it into government, even if they came into government with the hopes of making radical change, after trying to wrestle with all of these options,
They just give up and take money from them.
right, and so now when you have a country that has fabulous oil wealth or gold mines or diamond mines or some other viable natural resource that you can make money off of, you just start to look out for yourself. You look out for your friends and family. You're like, you know, if I can't fix the country, at least I'm going to make my life a little bit better. Caroline?
I have a question about reindustrialization.
Sure.
Did the Europeans not bring in anything to help them? Because I thought they kind of did during the World War to help them.
Good question. Didn't the Europeans help them industrialize? They helped some countries industrialize some, just enough to get them off the ground and be able to produce whatever they needed. They did not roll in, entire city blocks full of modern factories. Sometimes they're bringing them cast-off equipment, outdated machinery that's still better than what they had before. In some cases, they'll build it for them, but never share the designs or share the knowledge of how to do it. And so it ends up being just like it was with the Ottomans or with Egypt and Muhammad Ali, where they want not just the technology, but they want the knowledge, and the Europeans are like, nah, we don't want to give that to you. Ever? Why can't they industrialize? The fastest way to industrialize for them would be to take all of their money and invest it in development, right? But then what happens to their country financially during that transition period? They're not producing any raw materials, right? So it's that same issue as me trying to become an auto mechanic. The other issues are they don't have any place that they can colonize. There's no place left in the world for Nigeria to go and colonize and gain cheap labor, free access to raw materials, and a guaranteed market for their goods. All the things that made Europeans successful, right, other than their next door neighbor.
You take him over, and then you have colonies. Good for you.
Yeah, not going to happen. You also then, if we skip down to this very bottom one, because it makes more sense here, the environment actually now becomes a stumbling block to third world development. Nick, I feel like sometimes you just talk. No, it's not racist. Here's what happens. When Western Europe industrializes, are there any environmental laws? Are there any laws against strip mining? Are there any laws against child labor? Are there any laws about dumping toxic chemicals in the nearest body of water because it's convenient? No. That's one of the things that allows the West to industrialize so effectively and become so powerful. Because there's no rules they have to abide by. Nobody has to worry about carbon emissions. Are you kidding? Nobody has to worry about dumping or landfills or contaminating drinking water.
We do now.
Right, we do now, and that's the problem. That's why they can't industrialize the same way. They can't follow the European model of development because the European model of development is illegal now. You can't do... No, it's not because we're racist. It's because we realize there was a significant negative impact on the environment and nobody should do it. But the problem is this now doesn't give an alternative path to developing countries. There's only one way anybody's ever done it, and it was the Western method of industrialization, where you cut corners and you do bad things in the short term to get to the point where you can afford to not do those things in the long term.
There's also the Soviet way, in which you have a government that does the things to an greater extent and doesn't say it.
But even with their government, you're still doing the environmental things that way. They're still dumping stuff. They're still strip mining. They're still clear cutting forests. They're not worried about preservation. They're not worrying about renewable energy.
The difference with the Soviet way is that the government didn't say and give it.
But that doesn't change the fact that for these countries in 21st century society, they can't do either one, whether they say they're doing it or not. That's why China still gets so much criticism when they pull, 1,000 dead pigs out of a river. And the government says, no, we never did that. In fact, the drinking water's fine. Really? Emily?
Who enforces the laws? Like, what's about it?
Good question. Who enforces the laws and would prevent Africa from doing this? To some extent, it's global organizations like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. But to some extent, it's consumers. Some people will refuse to buy stuff from countries that practice unsafe production methods. How many people today buy organic because they don't want to support, a farming industry that just shoves growth hormones and whatnot into their food? How many people are trying to get away from the pesticides that make it easier to mass produce products? How many people don't want to buy from companies that employ child labor in sweatshops? So there are certainly lots of laws and organizations that will stop this, but there are also global consumers that will simply say, look, I'm not buying your product. I don't care how cheap it is. I'm not touching that because what you're doing is wrong. Nobody had that 300 years ago or 200 years ago. So how can they compete in a 21st century economic environment where they can't even play by the same rules that the people that are now on top used to play by?
But aren't the people who don't buy stuff from companies because of X or Y, aren't they still a minority?
Yes, but again, for these countries, even small portions of the consumer market have a big impact because it's not like South Africa is suddenly going to supplant China in terms of its manufacturing technology. They're only hoping to begin by gaining a portion of the market, which means they need to keep as much of that portion of the market as happy as possible. So, what are some things that you could do? Opportunities for economic growth. One, land reform. And we talked about this in Guatemala. If you want to give your country an economic jumpstart, take land away from foreign investors and give it to your people and let them slowly build themselves up over a few generations.
Doesn't that break the contract you made with the foreign company?
Right, but you're allowed to break contracts as a sovereign government. It just doesn't look good, especially if you want foreign investment. But if you want to rebuild internally, maybe that's the way you start. But again, that typically upsets people when you break those contracts. Now, another option is foreign aid. Like Nick suggested earlier, you get money from foreign developed first world governments. But what are some of the catches with that? Mari? Right. If you help some of these people too much, they now become competition for you. And it goes from being a charitable thing to, oh crap, we just helped them become as good or better than us. Now we're in trouble and we need help. So that's part of it. What else? They might not be able to pay you back. And so this goes from being a loan to a gift. And there aren't a whole lot of countries in the world that can afford to shell out millions or billions of dollars in gifts. Yes, Nick?
Didn't countries like the Soviet Union and us use this during the Cold War as a influence? So
Yep.
the Soviet Union would be like, here, you want to industrialize, we give you money.
Now do things our way. Right. And so this is where we get to what we call NeoColonialism. NeoColonialism simply being a new form of colonialism. But now instead of me actually putting boots on the ground in your country and occupying you, I just dangle the money and I say, here, you want it? You want it? You want it? Do a trick for me. Do a trick. Do what I want you to do. Make a government like the one I want you to make. Give me beneficial deals when you start producing. I want a discount. Here's what you have to do to get this money.
Destroy your neighbor who's chosen the other side.
Right. It's simply a new way of controlling them, financially rather than politically or militarily. Another way to do this is to perpetuate economic inequality.
How does that?
Well, it works the same way that the West did it. When Great Britain went through the Industrial Revolution, were they paying factory workers a comfortable living wage? No, they paid them next to nothing. And you know what happened? The country got richer, but the people didn't. At least not the people at the bottom. So here's another possible way of fixing it. Continue the economic inequality. Take advantage of your people for the good of the country. And let the people at the top get richer and use those riches for investment and grow it from the top, and eventually use what's called trickle-down economics, and hope that if the top gets rich enough, that money will trickle down to the lower classes. So, do you get a sense of hopelessness now? Have we depressed you a little bit? A little bit? A little? A lot, maybe? Now, we've got a little bit of time left. We're going to show you a few case studies of how this plays out. Oh, by the way, hang on. I wanted to show you this chart real quick. You know how we talked about the population boom? I want to give you some sense of just what this looks like. So we've got 1970 populations in all of these countries, 2000, 2012, and projected for 2050. Now, here's your baseline in the U.S. 205 to 282 to 314 to 422 million. That's relatively stable growth. It's not quite at just replacement level, where you would see a population level off. This is still growing. But I want you to look and see what's happening here. Now, India, we know, is one of the most populated countries on the planet. 500 million to 1 billion in 30 years. 1 to 1.2 in 12. And going from 1.2 to 1.6 in the next 38. Now, when you look at the decimals, that's pretty small, but what does that number actually represent from 2000? Right, 660 million. What did we see down here? Like 80 million, 40 million, 90 million, 600 million. That's tough to deal with. Here's another one. Look at Pakistan. Remember, partitioned by who?
Britain.
The British. 66 million, more than doubles in 30 years. In 12 more, it's another 40 million, and then by 2050 projected to almost double again from 2000. Emily?
Why does population usually grow more?
Food, healthier diets, better medicine, and not using birth control in societies that value large families. Here's the one I really want you to see. Nigeria, Check out the growth from 55 million to a projected 402 million. They're actually projected to surpass China sometime in the 21st century.
In birth rate or number?
In population. Yeah. Yes, Nick?
How does a country like India support more people, the same number or more people than China?
Well, to quote Jurassic Park, life finds a way. No, we're not going to watch Jurassic Park. Okay, 3 quick case studies. Well, I have no historical value, and you guys watch me a lot, so.
That's why we should watch Mulan or Saving Private Ryan.
No, my point was that means we take up enough time with things that have very little historical value, so.
Oh, it's okay. Quite a bit historical.
Anyway, 3 case studies. Ghana in West Africa, Iran in the Middle East, Egypt in Northeast Africa. And I want you to see how those trends that we talked about play out. Here you have somebody who comes into power, Kwame Nkrumah, with the idea of creating a very, very liberal society that will meet the needs of all people. In other words, lift up those people living in poverty and give them a better life. To do that, he searches for the financial aid option and aligns himself with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The downside is that then antagonizes the United States, and so there's always a price to pay. Again, it's that NeoColonialism. Whenever you make friends with somebody, you make enemies with their enemies. Reliance on raw materials, in this case, cocoa. And unfortunately, for Ghana, the global price of cocoa falls because of overproduction, which means Ghana's economy tanks lower than it already was after this very auspicious beginning. Now, obviously, at that point, if the country is losing money and the people are unhappy, what do the people typically demand?
Take out their anger and leader.
Right, kick out the leader and let's bring in a new guy. And so then Nkrumah, to keep himself in power, because he's convinced that his way is the right way, becomes a dictator and becomes oppressive and reduces and removes those very same freedoms and liberties he came into power to promote. Now, in Iran, we're going to see a few different trends. Iran is going to bill itself on the idea of religious unity. That religion and religious rules and religious practices will allow society to flourish instead of focusing on secular things. We also see, remember we've talked about traditionalists, how they typically want to look backwards and go back to when things were good and then make life like that again. That's part of what the Ayatollah, which is his title, Ayatollah, religious leader, that's part of what Ayatollah Khomeini wants to do, which is bring back the golden age of Muhammad. Simplify life. Go back to the days of Muhammad and get people to live like that again, which means we're going to separate ourselves from the West. We're not going to modernize and industrialize. But they are impacted by outside circumstances, namely a war with Iraq, and then foreign powers that don't like what they're doing. Then we see Egypt attempting a similar thing with Ghana, but we have a guy here who seizes power rather than being voted in, tries to then make the people happy by doing land reform and parceling it out, but that doesn't work. It doesn't actually improve people's lives. So then he nationalizes more land. He actually is the guy that takes the Suez Canal back from the British with the hope that that will then create more revenue for Egypt. But again, that's where you get into kind of the reverse of neocolonialism, where if you upset the people that were invested in your country, you don't get help. tries to create, hang on, give me one sec, tries to create some state-controlled supports for the people, whether education or this new fun project called the Aswan Dam, which doesn't work because it wasn't well built, and then it will eventually get tossed, but now there's more problems for society to fix. All right, so next class, I apologize for running late. You got your quiz on 33-34. We'll see you next time.